Colombia's oldest terror group becomes its newest political party. FARC bids farewell to arms as they enter parliament for the first time. But will the country accept their transformation? I'm Imran Gata, and today's Newsmaker is Colombia's Common Alternative Revolutionary Force. After more than 50 years as an outlawed group of rebel fighters, FARC has exchanged bullets for ballots by taking their seats in Colombia's Congress. It's a rebranding like no other, except they're still calling themselves FARC. They've kept their old acronym because they say they don't want to break with the past. And yet that seemed to be the major precondition of President Santos's peace deal. But the group is still fighting for the same things: an end to imperialism and rights of farmers. There's understandably some skepticism from the millions affected by the decades-long conflict. So, will FARC make this democratic experiment a success?
Desata la agresión armada contra Márquez, obligando a la conversión de las organizaciones de autodefensa en movimiento guerrillero.
A new political party, born out of decades of conflict, has arrived. The Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia is now the Common Alternative Revolutionary Force. A new FARC with a new symbol.
La rosa significa brazos abiertos para acoger.
The rose means open arms to welcome everyone, and that's why we want all Colombians to be linked to this party. We accept the challenge to change bullets for votes, and here we are. We will enter the political game legitimately, legally.
Under a peace deal forged in Cuba, one for which Colombian President Juan Manuel Santos won the Nobel Peace Prize last year, the FARC has 10 guaranteed seats of the 264 which make up Colombia's Congress. But the group is aiming to gain more in national elections next year. The FARC's transition from a fierce guerrilla force to a political one is not the first such attempt. Peace talks between the government, the FARC, and other guerrilla groups led to the creation of the Patriotic Union Party in the 1980s. But thousands of its members were murdered, many by drug dealers, right-wing paramilitary groups, and members of the incumbent government and army. Now many fear what's past is prologue. Dozens of social leaders, many of them demobilizing members of the FARC, have been assassinated this year. There is still a security vacuum in rural areas where the group holds sway, especially in the south and the east of the country.
This area has been plagued by activities such as drug trafficking, crime, illegal mining, extortion, contraband. And logically, as the FARC leave the area, other agents of criminal activity will try to occupy it.
As the FARC has come further into Colombia's political fold, handing over their weapons and taking a page out of the corporate playbook, with an online campaign to rebrand itself,
FARC, Fuerza Alternativa Revolucionaria del Común.
A divide within the group has surfaced, one part which seeks a broader coalition of the left, and the other rooted in the group's revolutionary past. But there is ample opportunity for the FARC to make political inroads, as its support is a few percentage points higher than Colombia's Congress. And while the FARC grapples to find a new identity, one which aims to be politically palatable to a large swathe of Colombian society, it does have a fresh start ahead of it, along with an opportunity to take on some of Colombia's most trenchant issues, while at the same time not forgetting its roots, those of them and for them, the rural poor. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this, I'm joined from Paris by a former FARC hostage, Ingrid Betancourt. She was kidnapped in 2002 while campaigning for the presidency. Colombian forces rescued her after she was held by the group for 6.5 years. And in San Francisco, we have John Lindsay Poland. He's the co-director of the Fellowship of Reconciliation Colombia program It's great to have both of you on the program. Ingrid Betancourt, such a pleasure and honor to talk to you. It's been 9 years, more than 9 years since you were dramatically rescued. Your former captors are changing. They've changed their symbols, rifles for roses. They are rebranding. Do you believe that they are seriously changing as a whole?
Well, of course, I have some reserves, but I hope that their intentions are serious and thorough. I think they have an incredible historic opportunity to change not only their lives and their destiny, but also to help Colombia become the country we are all dreaming about. And even if I have some reserves, I am also very aware that Colombia needs a political force that can speak out for those who have no voice. Colombia is a country that is profoundly divided and profoundly polarized. Today, the people that have a voice are the ones who have means, who have education, who have political power or economical power, but half of the population have not even an ID. They are not even recorded in the civil registry of the country. And those people are exploited, manipulated, they are victims of abuse, there's no justice, there's no law for them. And if I could dream about something, even though I was the victim of the FARC, I would dream of seeing them changing, of course, their rifles for roses, but more than for roses, for ideas, for the engagement, for the to change the destiny of half of Colombians that live in destitution. I'm not sure they will be able to succeed. I think it's a challenge.
Yeah, it's very interesting that you say that. And John, I'm gonna come to you in just a moment. But Ingrid, forgive me for asking. I mean, is this something that you truly only understood, or only truly understood during your time in captivity? Did it take for you to be in the jungle with these people for that long to kind of get why they do what they do? Did you develop a sort of deeper understanding of why they do what they do?
What I'm telling you is the belief I have since I entered politics in Colombia. We launched a party, the Green Party, and the banners of our party at that time was social justice and fairness, and it was it was applied against corruption. I still believe that even if we overcome violence and war, the profound issues that break our society, which are social injustice and corruption, are still there. The thing is that I believe also that the powers in place are part of the problem. And I believe that we need new people in the political arena to bring new ideas, new forces, to break the status quo that we have in Colombia right now. I'm not sure that the FARC are the ones that can do that, but I really believe that there's a representation that needs a voice. The left in Colombia, the political left in Colombia is very frail. Colombians are not satisfied with what the FARC as a guerrilla did in the country because of the violence. Colombia is a very spiritual and Catholic country. atheism, communist atheism is something that is uncomfortable for many Colombians. But if we put aside all this, I think that the FARC, because of the struggle of nearly 60 years, they have the legitimacy to speak for those who have nothing.
Right. John, let me ask you about...
And be credible.
Yeah, and that's interesting. John, do you believe that the FARC can be credible? Many Colombians, it seems, more than half, don't trust Rodrigo Londoño, the man they call Timochenko. They're skeptical, of course. You know, wounds are raw for many, many people. Do you think that they can be a credible political force as they inject themselves into the political sphere?
Well, I think they face many of the same challenges that all political leaders in Colombia encounter, which is that there's very little trust in political leadership in Colombia because, as Ms. Betancourt pointed out, the majority have been abandoned by the political process. So those leaders are not seen as credible unless they can really bring changes. And so this is not just an opportunity for the FARC as a political party, it's an opportunity for all sectors in Colombia to overcome the divisions and to address the structural inequalities that Colombia has suffered from for many, many decades. And I would add that it's an opportunity for the international community, which has often fed the conflict and inequality through certain kinds of investment as well as through military involvement. I'm speaking particularly about the United States. So it's an opportunity internationally because in the past, as the intro noted, the processes have been met with more repression, and we are seeing that now. You know, both members of the FARC in this year and their family members being killed, as well as social leaders in areas where the FARC was active and where social leaders and communities are challenging forces of narco-traffickers, of landowners, and are also being met with violence. So there's an opportunity not just for the FARC, but it does depend on what the process as well as individual parties within that process can really produce in terms of concrete change.
Yeah, Ingrid Betancourt, is that a fear of yours that as the FARC, who may have been brutal for a long, long time, but they amassed a lot of rural support, as they sort of get mainstreamed and go into the urban political sphere, you still have this vacuum in the rural areas amongst the rural poor? We saw the ELN recently caused some trouble. There's a group called the AGC I was reading about that runs a big chunk of the cocaine trade. Are we going to see more and more of these other groups try to fill this gap?
Well, it's a possibility. It's an opportunity for them. The vacuum is there. There's no one to fill that vacuum yet. I'm not sure if the actual commanders are the ones that are able to interpret the will of the destitutes. One of the things that I look from afar with some worry is the language they're using. I think that it's sometimes I feel that there is a sort of arrogance, some sort of haughtiness in the way they speak that is not favorable for uniting and gathering around them. You see, Colombians are a people of, it's a population of humble, working, good people, of people that have been abused for centuries. And they, even if the level of education is low, the intelligence is amazing. It's people very bright and with a capacity of human relation analysis very high. So they are observing. And if they see that these people are just getting into the system and playing with the same rules as the ones that have betrayed them, if they see that they become arrogant, if they forget them, if they want to be rich, if they want to have nice houses and live a comfortable life, forgetting the problems of the majority of Colombians, they will be abandoned. The vacuum will still be there. So you know, I think that this is kind of you have to be devoted to the cause. And what I'm just, you know, worried about is to see that for some signals that I have just been catching as I see them evolving and expressing themselves, I wish that they are not going to turn themselves into part of this corrupted, exclusive kind of club that Colombian politics is. Politics in Colombia are difficult because it's an arena, it's a space where all the ones who have power want to be there. And in Colombia, people with power are linked, not all, of course, it's not a majority, but I would say that the presence of paramilitary, of drug dealers, is still a problem in politics in Colombia.
Yep.
And so we will see how they turn.
Yeah. John, you know, people are extremely skeptical. A lot of people were skeptical last year when President Santos put this to a vote. Eventually, he just went to Congress when people said no. But someone who voted no was featured in a New York Times piece very recently. It was a piece about the Pope in Bogota. Her name was Helen Gonzalez. Her nephew had his leg blown off by the FARC. And she said, you know, the Pope may forgive them, but in my heart, I don't forgive them. I am still reconciling it all. And, you know, a lot of people like Helena Gonzalez. They want peace, but they also want a semblance of justice when they think of the violence. More than 220,000 people died. People have these long memories. John, is that going to be very hard for the FARC to reconcile themselves? Are they going to find it increasingly hard to win over people like Helena Gonzalez to say, look, we want to move on, we want to be a part of this process. We need you to accept that you might not get full justice for the peace that's on offer?
Well, of course, the FARC will never win over some people who were harmed by their actions. Although I would point out that in the referendum, which on the peace accords, which lost by a razor-thin margin, that the areas that were most heavily impacted by the war voted more proportionately in favor of the peace accords. So I don't think that her opinion is universal. I think, you know, it's also important to point out that the seats that the FARC is guaranteed by the peace accords, a little less than 5% of the congressional seats, are transitory. So if they don't win people's favor, if they don't make accomplishments, if they don't achieve some kind of land distribution and justice for violence in the countryside, they won't be voted back in.
Right.
They will become an irrelevant force. And so I think that's also important to note, and it really does depend on what they're able to achieve on those structural issues, which they have to achieve in alliance with other sectors in Colombia. They can't do it with a 5% in the Congress. They can't do it alone.
Yeah, that's a very important point. Let me ask you, Ingrid Betancourt, very finally, because you understand them better than most. You lived among them against your will. They held you as a hostage. They were in the jungles for half a century. They waged a violent, bloody war against the state. They did some unspeakable things. Now, as they go into politics, now as they become a part of the political system, from their perspective, from the FARC's perspective, would they consider all of this 50 years on worth it? Would they say, yes, we've achieved our goals? Or would they consider this current situation as a compromise and maybe a failure?
That's a good question. I would say that they have to convince themselves that it's a victory, but the victory won't be a victory unless they achieve through democratic means what they couldn't achieve through violent means. And only history will tell us if it's really a victory or not.
Ingrid Betancourt, John Lindsay Poland, it's been a pleasure talking to both of you. It's been thoughtful and I've learned a lot. Thank you very much for joining us on the Newsmakers. Still ahead, the Kremlin's KKK connection. We ask if allegations that Russia is influencing America's white supremacists are true. And is the US's relationship with Pakistan on life support? I speak with a former UN officer in Kabul who's for dropping more drones on the country. If you've consumed much American media lately, you'd be forgiven for thinking Russia is to blame for a lot of the US's problems, from hacking and meddling in elections to funding fake news on Facebook. And now, some are pointing the finger of blame at Moscow to explain the rise of America's far right. Some neo-Nazis see Russia as a powerful protector of the white race. But Russia has a proud history of fighting Nazism. And this latest charge is dismissed as anti-Russian hysteria. So, are Americans grasping at straw men, or is Russian nationalism inspiring white supremacy?
Scenes from a chilling night on August the 11th in the US city of Charlottesville, Virginia, when white supremacists and neo-Nazis marched to stop a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee from being taken down. Those Unite the Right protests on Friday led to a counter-demonstration on Saturday, which brought violent confrontations, a state of emergency, as well as the death of 32-year-old protester Heather Hare.
We have to become something greater than ourselves. We have to become part of a family, part of a story. And that's what the alt-right is.
It's been well documented that these white supremacists are homegrown Americans, but some argue that their cause is also being supported from abroad. A theory perpetuated at another alt-right rally in May. Russia is our friend! Russia is our friend! And the feeling could be mutual. A report published last month by a US intelligence agency noted, as with all of its 2016 election active measures, Russia is not planting seeds of discord and strife, but rather providing fertilizer and sunlight to an already existing bitter crop. Admiration of the Kremlin is something leading supremacists have no intention of hiding. Extreme nationalist Richard Spencer believes Russia is the sole white power in the world, while former Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke says Moscow holds the key to white survival. And they are backed up by the head of the white nationalist traditionalist Worker Party, Matthew Heimbach, who recently described Russian President Vladimir Putin as the leader of the free world and a person who has helped morph Russia into an axis for nationalists. But is there really admiration from both sides? Analysts say it doesn't make sense that Putin would support neo-Nazism given the millions of Russians they killed in World War II, while others make the point that President Putin supports Muslims within his country, opening Europe's largest mosque in Moscow in 2015. But Putin is used to being blamed for influencing America, given Russian hackers were accused of tampering with last year's US presidential election.
I can tell you honestly, I wish we had such an efficient, powerful propaganda machine in Russia, but unfortunately we don't.
So are America's white supremacists fabricating a relationship that doesn't exist? Or is President Putin simply playing the puppeteer? Vanessa Keneally, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Olga Khostunova. She's a political analyst and researcher at the Institute of Modern Russia. And in London, we have Marcus Papadopoulos. He's a Russia analyst and an editor at Politics First magazine. Thanks, both of you, for joining us. Olga, let me ask you very directly then. Is Russia supporting the white supremacist, neo-Nazi / alt-right movement in the United States?
Well, we have to define first the term supporting. So if you mean, is it funding those groups? I don't know if there is any proof of that. But if we are talking about, extending a hand or pronouncing some warm words of support, then definitely that's true. And there are various examples of that, starting from the International Russian Conservative Forum in St. Petersburg, where a number of ultra-nationalist parties and groups and movements were presented, and they all received a warm welcome from Moscow, and that forum was funded by the Kremlin.
Okay.
So in that sense, yes.
Okay, so Marcus, they're not really funding it. Maybe they're giving it a little nudge and an amplification. Does that make sense to you?
Look, the fact we're having this discussion in the first place is another reminder of the malignant power of the West, the power to deceive, the power to accuse other countries in the world of doing the very things that the American and British governments have been doing. And let's also not forget that this allegation against Russia of supporting white supremacists is extraordinarily offensive and disrespectful to Russians. The Russian people, along with the Jewish people, suffered tremendously at the hands of the Nazis. Indeed, the suffering of the Russian people and the Jewish people at the hands of Nazism is unequaled in history. 27 million Soviet people died because of the Nazis. President Putin's brother died in the siege of Leningrad. His grandmother was murdered by the Nazis. He had numerous uncles who never returned from the front. It is absolutely disgraceful that this unfounded allegation is being put out by Western politicians and Western media outlets.
Okay, so Olga, the West is in denial. They have their own social problems. They're just blaming Russia for their own social problems and trying to deflect. Olga, come back.
I just wanted to make a quick note, because I'm a Russian person and I can speak for some of the people who shared my views and my values. And I have to make a difference between the Russian government, the Kremlin, and the Russian people, because if the Russian government or any government whatsoever in a democratic country, and Russia claims it is a democratic country in the constitution, there's something that the government can do that the people may not agree. So in that sense, if there is an allegation that the Russian government may be funding those groups and there is evidence to that, that is more offensive to me and I think to the Russian people.
Okay, totally.
Can you cite evidence?
Can you cite evidence? Okay, so hold on. Let's move on. Let me try and figure out whether there might be ideological connections or whether it might just be pragmatic or it might just be coincidental, right? So let's try and get to the bottom of some of this. Marcus, I spoke to Alexander Dugin a few months ago. He's seen by, and you would agree, there's ample evidence that he's seen by many on the American alt-right as a kind of, almost in a way, a kind of spiritual father of new ideas, right? This anti-globalist idea. I spoke to him. Here's what he had to say about the presidency of Donald Trump. Have a little listen.
And he will try to make America America again, because before it wasn't America, it was a kind of globalist hub to impose on civilization and humanity. It's completely irrational, radical, anti-human values, so-called gay marriages, transhumanism, feminism, aggressive feminism. And I think now there is sane America, Trump's America, against ill America, sick America.
Marcus, would you agree that perhaps ideologically there's a kissing point between some of this kind of Russian nationalism, this Eurasianism, and some of what the alt-right is saying, and therefore that's why these guys warm to the likes of Dugin, and maybe from the Kremlin, there's a bit of an amplification going on?
First of all, I regard nationalism, be it American nationalism or English nationalism or French nationalism or Russian nationalism, as vile as Islamism, as vile as Wahhabism. If we're talking about Alexander Dugin, his views are his views only. They do not reflect the views of the Kremlin. And indeed, I think too much is made in Western media about Alexander Dugin and his influence on President Putin. I disagree to a great extent with a lot of Alexander Dugin's views. I do agree with him when it comes to his view on Ukraine. Ukraine is a historical part of Russia. Indeed, 90% of most of the former Soviet Union is historically Russian territory. But I do not agree with Mr. Dugin's views when it comes to Donald Trump. And Mr. Dugin has been proved to be absolutely incorrect if he thought that Donald Trump was going to be a different American president. But I don't want to go on a tangent. What I do want to say is that the reason why there is white supremacy on the rise in North America and Europe is down to a failed economic system in the West, the failure of the neoliberal capitalist system to look after all in society. That is why the extreme right is rising. And the Americans and the British have the audacity to accuse Russia of being complicit in the rise of neo-Nazism. Well, excuse me, it's Washington and London who's been supporting neo-Nazis and neo-fascists in Ukraine, who enabled the leadership of Viktor Yanukovych to be overthrown in February 2014 by fascists and Nazis. It was the Americans and the British.
But they would argue there's as much or as little evidence of that.
Yes, but every year in the Baltic states there are veteran Waffen SS veteran parades every year in the Baltic states. There's never been a condemnation by the Americans or the British.
Okay,
Why?
but you're accusing them of supporting neo-Nazis in Ukraine with as much evidence as you're claiming is lacking
absolutely to
in
bring
the US. Fair enough.
They did that to bring a pro-Western government to Kiev.
Fair enough. Okay.
Absolutely.
Let me ask Olga. Olga, might this be pragmatic? I remember I was in the United States in 2011. At that time, RT was just growing in the United States. They wholeheartedly embraced the Occupy movement, and a lot of that was sort of on the fringes of the left, right? And you almost, in many ways, you got the impression from RT as if it was sort of Tahrir Square in New York or in Washington, D.C. So might it just be pragmatic that from the Kremlin, they keep America busy? If ever there's something bubbling socially in the country, it's a little way to have a little nudge and a poke at the United States. But it might not actually be ideologically coming from Russia.
I'll just make a few notes on what's been said by Marcus. So I agree on Alexander Dugin's influence on Putin. I don't think it's a very influential figure. He does represent marginal views. I agree that the rise of the ultra-right is the result of economic stagnation. However, I don't think that the West is supporting Nazis in Ukraine, and there are some ultra-right groups in Kiev. However, I don't think there is any evidence they have that much influence that's being amplified by the Kremlin, and there is no fascist junta in Kiev, has been said. So going back to Putin's policies, I think we have to say that they have changed since the annexation of Crimea. So that was the turning point in Russia's foreign policy and the way Russia has been treating marginal groups around the West. So to sort of avoid international isolation after the annexation of Crimea, the Kremlin and Mr. Putin decided to look at what can be done to sort of take Russia out of this closing door. And what can be done better if you ally with groups around the West who do support the same cause as Russia, which is weaker European institutions, Western institutions, because those groups view them as failing and the result and the cause of all the evil in the world. So that's why the Kremlin reaches out to them. Well, in Europe, we can have a bunch of ultra-right parties that the Kremlin, I mean, there is only evidence that it's been funding the National Front in France. But there is a
National
number
Front
of
in France
groups,
is not a fascist or a Nazi party, come on.
Yeah. It is a nationalist
I don't
movement.
like the National Front in France. I don't like them at all. But you can't really argue it's a fascist party or a Nazi party. Come on, we have to be reasonable.
I don't argue
we have
that.
to be level-headed.
You're confusing what I've been saying. No, that's not what I said. You asked about the groups that the Kremlin has been reaching out to, and this is one of those groups. And there is evidence that the Kremlin has
but you're
funded
saying that the Kremlin's been reaching out to white supremacist groups in Europe, and you named National Front.
Okay,
I didn't say that.
People consider the National Front on the far right. People consider the National Front on the far right. As per your earlier argument, maybe there might be those people, Marcus, who might say, hey, come on, the Russians sacrificed millions of lives against the far right half a century ago. Why would they be supporting them? But let's put Marine Le Pen and Front National to the side for a second. Olga, let me ask you, is it harder for you to prove your thesis at a time when there seems to be a bit of Russia mania going on, particularly amongst Democrats and liberals in the United States, in the post-election atmosphere, because a lot of people believe that Hillary Clinton should have won that election and that Russia rigged the election on behalf of Donald Trump. It doesn't quite check out because she won the popular vote, right? But there's a belief that Russia hacked the election, and there's a belief that Russia gave the election to Trump. And because of that, does it make it harder for you to prove your argument that Russia's meddling in the United States with these far-right groups? Olga?
I think there is sort of Russophobia going on here in the US, and not in the sense that Marcus is describing it, but more like the left and liberal media and Democratic Party are trying to understand what has happened and why Donald Trump is the president. So the only reason they try to channel their anger is to, point to the obvious culprit, which is Russia, because Russia has been meddling in the media and has been meddling in the West for a while now, and this is an easy target.
Okay.
So this is really easy to point to Putin and say he's the person behind all of it.
Russia has been meddling in the internal affairs of Western countries. How would you explain NATO's presence on Russia's borders? How would you explain the American missile defense shield aimed at Russia's strategic nuclear deterrent? How would you explain the Americans lusting after one former Soviet republic after another to come into NATO?
I'm glad they're all rhetorical questions, Marcus.
If on their borders there was a Russian-led military alliance?
I'm glad they're all rhetorical questions because we have run out of time. It's been great having both your perspectives on the program. Olga and Marcus, I thank you for coming on to the Newsmakers.
Trump's threat to attack Pakistan whenever and wherever possible is an open declaration of war against Pakistan's sovereignty and integrity.
The U.S.'s relationship with Pakistan could be at a crossroads. The State Department has again repeated the Trump administration's demands that Islamabad change its approach to militant groups or face the consequences. The Pakistani government denies it's sheltering terrorists. This week, Islamabad hosted regional powers, including Turkey, Russia, and China, to discuss a response to U.S. policy, specifically how to prevent further escalation. There are fears the U.S. may resume drone strikes in Pakistan as part of its strategy against the Taliban. So what impact would a full-blown falling out between these two allies have in the region? Well, to help answer that, I'm joined now from Washington, D.C. by Christine Fair. She's a professor at the Center for Peace and Security Studies at Georgetown University and the author of Fighting to the End, the Pakistan Army's Way of War. Christine, good to talk to you. Tell me why you think Pakistan's a problem.
Oh boy, we don't have enough time to delineate all the reasons why Pakistan's a problem, but I think I can summarize it thusly. Pakistan has been using non-state actors, which it would call mujahideen, as a pivotal piece of its foreign policy since 1947. It's one of the first things that Pakistan did as it was becoming independent was sent a bunch of so-called mujahideen from the tribal areas to seize Kashmir. And its interference in Afghanistan actually began in the late 1950s. It began its jihad policy there in 1974, a number of years, obviously, 5 years before the Soviets actually invaded Afghanistan. So Pakistan has been very reliant upon this particular strategy for all of its existence, and it's very difficult for Pakistan to actually break the jihad habit. And as Pakistan acquired nuclear weapons beginning in the late 1980s, Pakistan developed a sense of impunity as well as immunity, that no one could really punish Pakistan for its reliance upon these non-state actors.
So what do you want to happen right now? We've seen these sort of limited sanctions and slaps on the wrist. That came from the Trump administration. Massive response from Pakistan. I mean, we've had the National Security Committee saying they're being scapegoated, the National Assembly passing a resolution against Trump's statements. They call them hostile and threatening. Former Chief Justice Iftikhar Chowdhury saying that the US is blaming Pakistan to hide its defeat in Afghanistan. So a lot of saber rattling, but what do you want the United States to do? Actually cut ties?
So, I mean, I think it's really important to understand that the Americans have made an increasing body of mistakes in Afghanistan, really from the beginning. So it's absolutely true that the United States has essentially lost the war in Afghanistan. But I have always argued that victory was never possible when it went to war with Pakistan, the singular country, along with Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, that actually wanted the Taliban to remain in power. So it's really important to understand that the United States went into this war with the wrong partner. It's sort of like putting a child molester, if you will, in charge of playground safety. So I think what this administration is going to have to understand very quickly is that our priority has to be Pakistan, not Afghanistan. We can't have even a face-saving exit from Afghanistan if we're not in a position to really put pressure on Pakistan. But we also need to have the ability to resupply not only American troops, although they're smaller in number, but more importantly, the Afghan National Security Forces, which are heavily reliant upon U.S. supplies. So Trump is going to have to make a choice. He can't both vilify Iran while also vilifying Pakistan. Now, I'm actually going to argue, and have argued, that Iran is far less dangerous than Pakistan. Iran is a regional problem. It's not a global problem like Pakistan. So I'd actually, in my ideal policy package, I'd like to see President Trump stop saber-rattling with Iran, build upon the really important and historic nuclear deal with Iran, capitalize upon our relationship with India, and actually use the ground lines of communication through Iran, beginning with the port at Chabahar, to move supplies into Afghanistan. So that will give us much more space to resupply our Afghan partners. At the same time, we really need to think differently about aid to Pakistan. Pakistan thinks it's entitled to my money. Its elites don't pay taxes, so every time I write my check to our tax service, the IRS, I'm paying Pakistan's taxes. I think we need to cut off, in a very dramatic way, economic support. We must cut off financial support to Pakistan's military. Particularly, we have to disallow it from procuring strategic weapon systems, which are not suitable for its domestic battle against militancy. It only wants those weapon systems to fight India. And we have to get rid of entirely this program called Coalition Support Funds. We're essentially paying Pakistan to kill terrorists. Terrorists that it has actually created itself. And in other words, it's sort of like paying your kid to keep cleaning his room,
but you're
really
never
fair? Paying your kid to keep his room clean.
But is that really fair? I mean,
absolutely fair.
Given that there are two Talibans, right? So you have the one that actually attacks Pakistan within its own homeland, and then the other one across the border in Afghanistan that the ISI is accused of supporting, and not without evidence, right? So you have these two Talibans. Now,
it's a fact that there.
Okay, fair enough.
There are two Taliban organizations.
Sure, certainly. Okay, so I've got two questions then regarding the two Talibans. On the one hand, there seems to be ample evidence that the Iranians and the Russians are also supporting the Taliban in Afghanistan. So are they also the problem now? Should Trump also now, go after them? Doesn't that sort of contradict what you're saying about Iran? Because that Taliban's also getting support from Iran and Russia.
No. Yeah, so actually what's really, I'm very glad you mentioned the Iranian and Russian support. First of all, it's actually, we don't really have a lot of information about the extent to which they're supporting the Taliban. My understanding, and I just came back from Afghanistan, the Afghans really believe that this is happening in a big way. Intelligence analysts here call that sort of Afghan math because there is often exaggeration of that. The Iranians haven't really changed the level of support that they've been giving to the Taliban really since the mid-2000s, and this is tactical support. You know, so from what's happening from Russia's point of view, and Russia, I think, really is a larger concern in a lot of ways. Russia has always been antagonistic to the U.S.-NATO efforts there. Russia actually, we couldn't use the northern distribution route to resupply either NATO troops or the Afghans because the Russians will not allow us to move lethal goods through the northern distribution route. And that was always in place when we were trying to figure out alternatives to Pakistan. Russia is now justifying its cultivation of the Taliban based upon an exaggerated fear of ISIS in Afghanistan. So what's actually happening is that Russia and Iran are trying to figure out what is going to be the end state in Afghanistan. Ultimately, Iran is going to have to live next to that state. And, you know, Iran, as well as Russia, I think, are actually hedging their bets.
But isn't that the Pakistani
and of course, if you're Iran
perspective? We have to live in the neighborhood,
well,
so we
actually,
have to hedge our bets?
Yeah, but the difference is Pakistan is creating the instability. Iran is having to figure out how to live next to the instability that Pakistan has created. All else equal, what Iran would prefer is a stable Afghanistan, not in the control of the Taliban, which, oh, by the way, is what most Afghans want. What Pakistan prefers is a Taliban-controlled, right? And if it can't have that, it wants chaos.
Okay,
so the preferences are really quite different.
Let me then ask you, I mean, what kind of backlash do you fear if the Trump administration ramps up its sanctions, and I use the word sanctions across the board, we can talk about it militarily, politically, and so on, against Pakistan, and starts to treat Pakistan as a non-ally? What's the worst-case scenario?
What the Pakistanis have really learned is that they seem to think that the Americans need Pakistan more than Pakistan needs us. And I think they have a good reason to conclude that if you look at the mysterious and bizarre behavior that the United States has exhibited towards Pakistan. I think what many Pakistanis are then banking on as the United States withdraws its largesse, I think the next step, which I don't think the Americans will take, would be that the Americans allow the IMF to do whatever it wants with Pakistan. What happens traditionally is that Pakistan reneges on its own commitments to the IMF withdraws. Some years later, the Pakistanis go back and they say, we need more money. And even though they failed to honor their previous commitments, which they themselves made, the Americans put pressure on the IMF to give the money. The logic being that the Americans think Pakistan is too important to fail. So I think a real test will be how this administration deals with this IMF relationship. I don't even know if this administration understands the IMF relationship. I think the Pakistanis, they are angry, they are worried, and I think Trump, unlike Obama, has this unpredictability to him that he might actually be scaring the Pakistanis in a way that the Americans haven't been able to do since the moments after 9/11. And maybe that's the one upside to this unpredictable, menacing president, is that for the first time in about 16 years, we have a credible threat.
Yeah, you and Trump might have finally found some common ground. Christine, I've got to wrap. I've got to move on.
No, we don't.
I thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Christine.
There's no common ground.
It's time to go off script. Africa, the continent where the countries are either in stability or chaos. It was nice to see the New York Times editorial board do a little U-turn recently with this piece. Kenya's giant step for fair elections after the Supreme Court decided to annul the recent vote. This came just weeks after this editorial. The real suspense in Kenya, alleging sour grapes from the guy who lost, Raila Odinga. The New York Times called him a perennial loser with unsubstantiated claims and lectured him not to cause riots and basically to get over it because he lost. They were given confidence by the fact, I guess, that the AU EU and Carter Center all rubber-stamped the election as free and fair and credible. Sometimes international observers get it wrong. Here's another from the National in the UAE. Kenyan opposition rejects the election result to plunge country into chaos, which makes it all the more gutsy from the Kenyan Supreme Court to look at the evidence and say, hold on, not so fast. There are major irregularities with this vote, including more than 5 million unverified ballots. So, fine. Everyone thought Raila and his supporters were sore losers, but when the judicial branch of government cancelled the win for the incumbent, President Uhuru Kenyatta, and called for a rerun, you would expect that to be welcomed, right? Nope, not by everyone. Take a look at this Bloomberg headline. Kenya plunges into turmoil after court annuls presidential vote. Plunged into turmoil. Why? This was something unprecedented. For far too often on the continent, the law is an ass, the donkey type, not the other one, where politicians treat it as a beast of burden to just get to where they need to go. Not this time in Kenya. Let me give you a quick comparison with another election last month in Rwanda. Paul Kagame has been in charge for 17 years. He came to power after a horrendous genocide, and he did a lot of good things to get the country back on its feet. He recently won 99% of the vote. I'm no Catholic, but I don't think even the Pope would be able to get 99% of the votes in Vatican City. If you look closely, there's a recurring word every time you look at the reaction, media-wise, to Kagame's 99% win. Take a look at some keywords, or one in particular. Have a look at that word, stability. Why isn't the authoritarianism in Rwanda a cause for concern? Why is it always stability, stability? Why won't it possibly plunge the country into turmoil? Are we conditioned to believe, when it comes to Africa, that the tighter the grip, the more stable the country? Look, Kenyan opposition leader Raila Odinga might be playing with fire, especially since he has threatened a boycott of the rerun. Maybe there will be trouble. But why not ask the same questions when it comes to Kagame? Why isn't the fact that someone who has absolute rule over a country, the fact that he invaded his neighbor, the DRC, more than once, the fact that he's been accused of assassinating critics, why aren't they front and center, or at least, I don't know, factored in when we report on this and his 99% wins? Do we actually want to see democracy, warts and all, in action in Africa, or just the facade of democracy so we can report that the Africans are calm and there's stability? If we do, let's be honest about it and not pretend we care about the will of the people. That's all for this edition of the Newsmakers with me, Imran Gabda. Thank you very much for watching. Bye-bye.